If ever you've been to car boot sales, flea markets, or even eBay, you've probably seen one of these. You've probably seen one of these. This is a vintage brace, and this is a vintage auger bit. These are really cheap to buy when you look around, and these are amazing to use for bushcraft, green woodworking, and a whole array of skills and hobbies. So in this video, a friend of mine, Lee Stoffer, is going to teach you what to look out for when first buying these. And secondly, we're going to look at actually refurbishing these so they're optimal condition for you to use. So, hope you enjoy the rest of this video. So, Lee Stoffer.
Hello.
How you doing?
I'm very well, thanks.
Good.
You?
So let's start off with the brace.
Indeed.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the first thing I do need to mention, this brace and the selection of auger bits have actually been very generously gifted to me by a friend of mine called Moskin Joe, who very generously gifted these. From someone that passed it on to him. So we'll start off with the brace first.
Yep.
Okay.
There's your selection of bits, which looks like quite a decent selection.
So with the brace, the first things first. So obviously these are out and about when you get to car boot sales, etc. So what's some basic advice that people should be looking out for when purchasing one of these?
Well, there's a couple of different sorts. This is a fairly common and generic one, which has got the ratchet mechanism on, which is always a nice thing to have if it's present and correct, which basically means you've got this little collar that you can twist to engage a ratchet here in either direction. So if you're in a tight space or you've got a really big bit in the brace, then you can only really physically move it by pulling it towards you, where you've got your strongest muscles doing the work. You can use it like this, so you can just pull in and then it can just ratchet back, so you can keep progressing the bit without having to go a full lap round. If you're in between floorboards, for example, same thing. You can work in a fairly confined space with it, and you'll get different versions of this in terms of, you might find that this crank is a bit longer or shorter. The overall length might vary, but this is a fairly, from what I can tell, a fairly common pattern. It's a Stanley, and the number on it is a number 78, and then it's a 101N, it says. Traditionally, I think these are normally beach. The handles on, you can see the varnish that's been applied has flaked off over the years. There's a few wormholes in here. Chances are they're probably exit holes, so probably nothing too much to worry about, and it's still nice and solid. It's not crumbling away, so I'm not overly concerned about that. But we could, if necessary, you can detach it here. There's 3 screws, and then behind here there'll probably be a circlip that holds this plate on, so you could technically turn a new end bun if you needed to. And you know, the way these things work, you're either going to put your hand on the top of that and rotate it like this, or you might hold it into your chest and rotate it like this. Sometimes I'll end up, if you're working over a bench, and you sort of lean on it with your head to put a little bit of pressure down. There's all sorts of different ways you can use them, but they're really versatile. They give you quite a lot of power, certainly enough to drill a hole up to 1 inch in diameter quite easily. And they work on the basis of having these type of bits with this tapered square that fits into the chuck. So more modern auger bits will have like a hexagonal shank on them, which, although they will technically, you'll find 2 points that will register in there, they're not tapered, so they can damage the jaws, which are made out of a fairly soft steel inside there. So it's not recommended to really use modern auger bits in these old braces. And this isn't in bad shape. As we can hear, the ratchet works okay. This is turning quite nicely.
So that should be turning the top bit. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. So this is the bit that's you're going to hold on to steady it, to keep it in line and to put some pressure down. But, so you want it to be able to spin freely whilst you're turning this, in the same way that this needs to spin freely to be comfortable. Otherwise it's just going to create friction. As is quite common, you know, there's a little bit of surface rust on it, but it's nothing horrendous. Probably the inside of here is going to be the grubbiest bit, which is going to also affect how this works in terms of loading the bit. So I'm just going to reset that so that it's locked up now. So the ratchet's not working in either direction. It's just locked up as solid as it can be, with obviously the little bit of play that's involved there. But I think it's going to be worth taking this apart and just seeing how grubby it is inside, because this is a working part, so it's not going to do any harm to give it a little clean. So we've basically got the outer shell of the chuck, and then the jaws themselves that are inside it. And in this case they've got like a little wire spring that just makes them like a set of crocodile jaws as such. So inside here is a taper that works on these faces here, so the more you wind it in, the closer it tightens it up around one of these tapered square bits. So you can see it fits in there with the corners, so when it's inside the chuck it's basically gripping it like that. So this part of the jaw is gripping the square and stopping it from pulling forwards, and then these little V's here will come in and sit and support the main shaft of the auger there. And yeah, it's in reasonable shape, but it could be a little bit cleaner. Right, so we've got this disassembled now. There's only a couple of basic components. You can see there's a little bit of surface rust on them, nothing too major. All I've got here is a bit of white spirit, an old toothbrush and something to pour the white spirit into. We can actually give the jaws a little bit of a soak in there. You should be able to see there'll be a bit of muck coming off. This is just cleaning off a few years worth of dust and grime and general muck. It's not massively interfering with the way the thing works, but it will make it a little bit smoother in operation, hopefully. So we're just basically cleaning it, nothing major. And that's where I would say an old toothbrush is quite useful for getting in. If it's a bit more stubborn than that, you can pick up these sort of little brass wire brushes. They're going to help to clean off any more stubborn stuff. You can see it's already coming up much better than it was. There's no need to go silly about it, we're just going to get rid of some muck really. There's no horrible graunchy noises when you're operating it, so there's not loads of dust in there anymore. Just going to get in behind that bit of spring there. I'm sure these must probably have slightly different jaws in different braces. In this case the spring's captive. I'm not sure if that's the case on all of them. I haven't taken hundreds of them apart, so you might find that it comes out and you've got a handful of separate bits that you've got to try and work it out to put back together, but in this case that's come up pretty reasonably clean.
So in that case, in terms of when you're disassembling it,
yeah,
should one pay kind of particular caution to how you disassemble it?
Yeah.
So you kind of remember how it goes back together?
Absolutely. I mean, if you lay a bit of newspaper out on your bench, just very carefully unscrew it and try and cover it. Occasionally when things come like this out, if there's springs involved, things can disappear in a hurry. If you've got a big pile of shavings on the floor, chances are you're not going to find them, so it might be worth having a sweep up first just in case. It's quite handy to have one of these little magnetic trays around if you're going to take any of these little screws out. It's quite handy to have something that is going to stick to a magnet if it's going to stray off the bench. But we're just going to get a bit of white spirit on here and clean up inside this chuck as well. Just rotating this as I go and working through. Now these parts have been chromed, and there's places where the chrome's flaking off a little bit. There's not a lot we can do about that really, but it's not massively important. It's just a protective layer. Once it's gone, it's gone. Occasionally you can get little splinters off of chrome, so if you see any edges that are lifting, it might be worth getting a little file and just sort of scraping back and seeing if there's any loose bits that are likely to catch on your fingers, because I've had bits of flakes of chrome get embedded in me before and it's not particularly comfortable. It's a bit like getting a wood splinter, but far more prone to break when you're trying to get it out. So just getting a little bit of a clean in here. What I'm going to do is just wind that in and just keep turning it and stuffing it in until it's kind of filled up the whole space. So we're making sure we soak up all of the white spirit and hopefully any of the muck that might be attached to it. We've just got the end coming out there. So we know we've got the inside of that reasonably clean. It's not bad. And then the same with this bit really, we've just got a little bit of surface rust on these threads. So a bit of white spirit again, and in the ratchet mechanism as well. It's not going to do any harm. This is where the wire brush might actually come in a bit better. See that slightly more stubborn rust coming away with this. We don't want to be too aggressive. We are only cleaning it up. This is where it's worthwhile, say, protecting your clothes a little bit, because this is going to fly about a little bit. And also your eyes. I've got some safety specs on, just in case bits of this flick up. It's not very nice stuff to get in your eyes. Probably not the best stuff to have on your skin, to be perfectly honest, but you could always wear latex gloves. And then to get inside here, I'm going to have to go with a toothbrush again. If that'll fit, just get in there and give it a little scrub. Right, so we can see we've got a bit of surface rust on this chrome here. We could use the wire brush, but it's not going to be quite as effective. I've got just a little bit of steel wool here. I'm going to dip that in the white spirit again, and hopefully we'll be able to see if this is just sitting on the surface, which I suspect it probably is. This should take it off reasonably quickly without removing too much of the character and kind of patina from the tool itself. When you could spend hours getting this back to kind of brand new, but we're talking about bringing it back into service and getting it working for a purpose. So really all we want to do is prevent this rust from going any further and clean it up so it's not going to rub off on our hands while we're using the tool. So we just keep it fairly quick, get the worst off, and know that it's, even if it's still visually there a little bit, we're a lot cleaner than we were on all of these components before we then go in and put a little bit of oil in places just to keep things working properly. And just where this is a bit got this knurling on, the wire wool, steel wool's not going to get in there, so I'm just coming in with the wire brush again. That's probably the worst bit there on that corner. You could come in with something more aggressive, like an abrasive paper maybe, but with a little bit of time and effort, the wire wool should give you a reasonable result. What I'm really aiming to do is just make sure it's not going to flake off and make things dirty whilst we're using it. So that's, give this a little wipe now. Right, so we've got the bits fairly sympathetically cleaned up now. You can see we've got rid of the rust, but without taking away any of the real character of the tool. It still looks like an old tool. So we're now just going to do a little bit of lubrication when we're putting this back together. I'm going to use a little tiny bit of grease. I don't want to go mad, but the chuck slides inside this piece, in this bit, the jaws. So I'm just going to rub a little bit of grease inside there, and this is just multi-purpose grease, and we don't want loads of it, we don't want it spilling out, so just enough to kind of moisten the surfaces a little bit. And the same on the moving parts of these, just perhaps rub a tiny bit in to the parts that are going to slide inside. Don't really want them on the parts, so much on the parts that are going to grip the actual bit itself. That's that. So then that's going to slide in like so, and we can perhaps put just a smear on the back of there, and just probably on a little finger would be best, just inside here on that tapered surface. But I'm just going to make sure I don't want any excess there. I'm just going to wipe off any bits off of there. Now the other place we probably do want a little bit is just on the front end of this thread here. If we just put a little bit of grease in the threads, we know we're going to screw the chuck body on from this end, so we don't need to grease the whole thing up, otherwise it would just end up pushing a load out the other end and getting all messy. So what we can do is then pop them back in there like that, Just squeeze them together, pop that on, and then as we screw that on, the thread's reasonably tight, so it's going to carry that grease down the thread and make this nice and free. And that's already feeling a whole lot better than it did. It was a bit graunchy before. Now I'm going to wind it up and down a couple of times just to get that grease moved around and where it wants to be. Then we can just give the whole thing a little bit of a wipe. Make sure there's no excess grease everywhere. Now we could put a little smear of grease in here as well for the ratchet. Again, if I load the little catch plate up on both sides, turn it one way, spin that round a few times, go the other way, spin it the other way a few times. That'll make sure that's all spread about. Now this, you can see that rotating bit there, a little bit of oil is probably more appropriate there, so just a bit of 3-in-1, bit overkill there, but let that soak in a second. Then we can just wipe off any excess. Same goes for this grease. I'm just going to hold the paper in contact there and just clean off any excess, but we know hopefully we've got some in to the working parts. You notice there's a little hole here, that's so we can put a drop of oil just to keep that nicely lubricated in there. And again, if we just rotate that around a little bit and then kind of park the hole at the bottom and catch anything that drips out. And in terms of the way it works, we can't really get in there to lubricate. It's a fairly loose fit anyway, and it's plenty free enough. Reset that to being locked up. And in terms of the metalwork, I think that's looking pretty decent now, and we've lubricated the parts that need to be lubricated. So the next thing to do is just maybe clean up the woodwork a little bit. Right, so we just want to get some of this flaky varnish off, I think. I'm going to try and use a scraper to start with and see how that fares. Probably start from the widest point and coming out, just scraping back some of this varnish. You can see that's coming off quite happily. I'm going to start from the middle and work my way out to the edge because it's tapered. There's a good chance that the grain, if it was a nice straight bit of timber that they were working with, there's a good chance that that's the way the grain will be running, so it'll scrape a lot easier that way.
So in essence, you're removing the initial varnish that was put on?
Basically, yeah, because it's obviously started removing itself and looking a bit mucky. It's also, again, a bit on the flaky side, so it's not necessarily the most comfortable on your hands when you're using it. It can feel a little bit abrasive. So I'm just going to go and scrape some of this back. You could just use sandpaper. Maybe a paintbrush to make sure we don't get too much dust inside that mechanism. You could obviously, if you'd really gone to town cleaning this up, you could start masking this off now, but we need to be able to rotate it, so we can't go too mad in trying to protect everything. So that's pretty much got it that way. Now I'll go the other way. So what I'm using here is a fairly generic cabinet scraper, and this one's got like a curved top and bottom. Some of them are just like cards that are square. You get more ornate shapes, but what also works fairly well actually is the back edge of a Stanley knife blade. It's not quite as effective, but you can get, there's not actually any flaky stuff to come off now, but you could, I mean, if it's a blunt one, you can even use the edge as a scraper. You just might put the odd cut mark on, but you can see we're raising some fairly basic shavings there. Any way around it, you can actually make these out of old panel saws. If you've got an angle grinder and the means to cut this up, obviously you don't want the bit with the teeth on it, but if you look, it's a very similar thickness and a similar material to what these are made out of, so you can use old blunt saws to make your own scrapers up if need be. Of course, the other option we've got would be just to sand it. Got a bit of Abranet here, and I'm going to finish this off and try and make it quite nice and uniform with a bit of that. There's a few mucky bits near the edges. Now at this stage we could go back to what the manufacturer did and varnish it, or we could paint it even. I generally prefer to see the wood grain, so I think just a bit of oil will probably do the trick. So I'm just going to get the rest of the varnish off of this top part now, and I'm just going to hold it because obviously this wants to spin around, so I'm going to hold that sort of against my body and just use this scraper to get the worst of that off. This one being a slightly more complicated shape is probably going to require a bit more sanding, I think, but we can certainly get the worst of this flaky varnish off the easy way. And so we can see a few of these wormholes, which say every chance is these are exit holes, and whatever's digging them was long since gone. Back to the sandpaper, I think, or the Abranet in this case. It's quite a decent abrasive for cleaning up wood, I've found.
So if you want to go to town on this, could you kind of detach that handle, please?
You could actually, and you know, there could be a benefit in doing so. You've got these three little screws, and then there's probably a circlip behind here somewhere holding this plate on, and you could disassemble the whole thing and clean inside here as well. This is spinning really nice and freely, so there's no noise or graunchiness. I don't see any particular reason to do that. I think just to get it up and running, we'll give it a bit of a gentle clean and try and be fairly sympathetic about it, I think, really, as well, not overdo it. But yes, you could definitely strip it down even further than that. You could disassemble the whole thing, with the exception of getting this off. I think that might be fitted as part of the manufacturing process, so if you wanted to replace that, you'd probably have to turn it, split it, and then glue it back together around the shaft. But if they need, you know, if these parts were desperately in need of replacement, it wouldn't be the end of the world to do so if you've got a lathe that you could turn them on. A bit more difficult if you haven't, of course. And it's not really the kind of work you could do on a pole lathe, I don't think. Technically possible, but practically quite difficult, I'd imagine. Because we've got to turn a recess in here and get this nice domed surface. So there'd be an element of work to be done in preparing the billet for a pole lathe, or hand finishing it after the event. So that's looking pretty decent. There's a bit of natural sort of coloration that's come about through age. Just give it a gentle rub under here as well. So we've got these reasonably clean. I haven't gone silly with it because I think it's nice to actually maintain a little bit of the character that was there. And I'm just going to use a little bit of boiled linseed oil. Don't need loads of it, so I'm just going to squeeze the brush out a little bit. And you should see that this helps to bring out the grain a little bit. Another one you probably want to avoid getting on your skin if you can help it, but it does, so it helps to feed the wood a little bit. Just get it on that bit of end grain. Same up here, and I think that's the better solution than the oil, the varnish that was on it, because the chances are, you know, this will soak into the wood, but it shouldn't ever start cracking on you. Just let it soak in a little bit and then take off any excess. And you know, we can see that's brought that up quite nice, but it doesn't look brand new, does it? It looks quite reasonable. Same on the top here, just paint a bit on with the brush. I'm going to flip it over. Just a light coat. Again, give it a few seconds to soak in a little bit. You'll see the bits that are really thirsty, it would look quite dry quite quick. But the thing with linseed, boiled linseed oil especially, is it does dry reasonably quickly. and if you lay it on too thick, you'll find it can feel a little bit sticky when it's dried, and that can cause blisters, or certainly a bit of discomfort. So there we go. I think that looks quite authentic and pretty decent now. So we'll call that a job done and set it aside for the oil to dry a bit and have a little look at some bits.
So now the brace is done, that's been put to one side to cure. Lee's pulled out one of his own braces to demo the next section of this video. And in this video we're going to look at a lineup of augers and the types and varieties and things to look out for.
Okay, so far we've looked at obviously the brace, it's just going to hold on to the bit. Now the first bit that we're going to look at is the only one of this particular pattern that I've got, which doesn't actually fit in a brace. It's much bigger and it's got an eye on the end that you put a bar through to drive it. But you can see here it's got this kind of right angle cutter here. So this one cuts the side of the hole and this one cuts the material out of the centre of the hole. So it's going to hopefully cut a fairly neat hole. Now I'm not going to go into the names for these various patterns. We'll put a link in the description where you can go and do a bit more research on that. But the important thing to kind of try and establish here is that we can see that there's lots of variations in these, but the important things to keep an eye out for, really, the very first thing is the lead screw. This part is quite important in these bits, and what it does is it pulls the bit into the work. So if these are damaged, especially on the tips, it's going to cause problems. It's not going to want to pull into the work, and it's, you know, it's going to hinder the cut. Basically, you're not going to be able to make good progress. Also, if the cutters aren't sharp, you're going to get into the point where it starts trying to cut, and what you might do is just like pull the lead screw out, stop it from biting, and kind of just pull a load of waste out that's built up in these threads, and it's not going to want to drive through. So we need sharp cutters and we need a good condition lead screw. If the lead screw looks mucky, you might find that it's just like a build up of wood dust in it, which you can just whip out with one of these little wire brushes like I was using to clean up the brace itself. But then the other thing to consider is the design of the bit. These ones with the straight cutters, like these four here that we're looking at, they've all essentially got a similar feature in as much as the cutting edge that's going to remove the waste is a straight, like a chisel. They've also got different ways of relieving the side of the hole. This one's got quite a curved cutter to it. This one's got the right angled wing to it. Then this one's a bit different, and I think this is kind of a modern interpretation. It's still got the tapered square on the end, but it's got this set up so you've got a single straight cutter on one edge and then a curved sort of scribe to mark out, to cut the grain in the circular fashion before it starts to hollow it out. So this is a bit of an anomaly, this one, and I think fairly modern in comparison to the rest of what we're looking at. I just wanted to show it because it is a little bit different and I thought worth mentioning. But I'm going to put that one to one side and then look at these two. Now the difference with these is they haven't got a straight cutter. They've got, in this case, a hole through which is sharp all the way around the edge, and there's two of those. And then this one, which is very similar in as much as it's a curved cutter, but it's just like a wing that doesn't close up. So the main difference is the ones with the straight edges are going to be good for cutting in through the side grain of the timber. The ones with the rounded cutting edges are going to be more efficient going into end grain. For any of them to work, the cutters have got to be fairly sharp and the geometry's got to be about right. So I think the next thing to look at is just to pick up a couple of these at random and try them in some wood and see how well they perform. So what we've got installed here is a cutter that's about 1 inch in diameter. What you will find is sometimes on the tangs here, on the tapered square bit, they'll have an impression which tells you the size. Okay, normally these are going to be imperial sizes because these are old bits. This one actually says half, so you've got a 1 over a 2. So that means ½ an inch. It could also be numbered as a number 8, which would be 8/16, which also equates to ½ an inch, which is a fairly common numbering system for this. So this is a 1 inch bit that's installed in this brace already, but on the tang it's numbered 16 because it's 16/16, i.e. 1 inch. So let's see. I've got a piece of pine in the vise here. Let's just see how this cuts. So we're going to start it, put a bit of pressure down and just start to turn it. And what I want to do is try and maintain that this is fairly straight up and down. Sometimes it helps if you're drilling something that needs to be accurate to have a mirror so you can help yourself keep alignment. And if I just withdraw it at that point, we'll see the benefit of these curved cutters actually scribing the shape that we're going to cut the waste out of. So they're effectively severing the grain that's going to be removed, so we're less likely to get tear out. So that's quite a nice feature.
So that's the first indication to look out for.
For when we're cutting in from the side, that's quite important, I think, if you want a clean hole. There are other patterns of cutter that might not have these on, but will still remove the waste, but they might leave a rougher finish on the top surface there. So it really depends what kind of hole you're after and how clean the finish needs to be, what bit you're going to choose, and how well set up the bit is for that matter. So let's just get that lead screw to engage again. You can see without much effort from me, the lead screw's pulling that bit in, and now we're getting to the point where we're just starting to engage the cutting edges. We can just start to see a shaving lift here, and if it's set up well, there'll also be a shaving lifting off the back edge. So that tells me that these cutters are set up reasonably well in terms of we've got a shaving coming off of both of them, not just one of them. And I'm just going to try and keep this nice and straight. I'm not having to put a lot of effort in, which suggests that this is reasonably sharp, and it's pulling its way down. An inch, you know, when you get into a cut, it can get quite hard work, and this isn't particularly hard work. It's a fairly soft wood, but cutting an inch hole in it without the ratchet isn't difficult. So that's quite pleasant, and I think the size of these shavings coming off, they're a pretty good indication that that bit itself doesn't really require any work to make it cut. We've got a fairly clean entry. There's a bit of tear out inside the hole, but actually the top surface is quite clean, as are the side walls inside. So we're fairly happy that this one cuts okay. I'm just going to take a little bit of masking tape, find the end, and I'm just going to wrap that around this shaft here, just so that we know that that one works. We don't need to give it any more attention. Then I've installed one with the same type of setup. The difference here is, if we can notice, the cutting edges are basically the same. It's a different diameter obviously, but we've still got these little kind of half moon cutters and then the straight edges. But if we look at the spiral, it's different. This one is twisted out of a flat section, and I think this one's probably cast, so you've got this central shaft and then this single helix. Could find that this is potentially less likely to chock up with waste inside the hole because there's more space for the waste to come out. But you also find that having the double helix here is probably more likely to help you keep the hole nice and straight. If you're boring a deep hole, this has got the potential to wander more because there's less contact, because these bits actually taper very slightly. So the important part is at the front end here is going to be what sets the diameter of the hole, and then you'll probably find that these have been relieved very slightly to allow it to progress, whereas these ones will be a straighter section. And actually, coming back to this one, you can see it's much thicker. It's this type of style with the single helix, but they're much deeper, these parts, so that's going to help it again to keep straight in a hole but create more friction. So there's always a trade-off. But let's try this one out. It's a smaller diameter. The lead screw is in pretty decent condition. The point's very slightly damaged, but it's still just about there. It looks like it's taken a tiny little bit of damage. So let's see if it'll bite first. If it'll bite, then we maybe got a chance of cutting. So I'm going to start it off in the same way. A little bit of pressure down, and it's putting into the work okay. But then I'm putting quite a bit of pressure down on the top now, and that's struggling to lift a shaving at all. So what's happened is the lead screw has just bottomed out, and there's not enough edge on these cutters to actually to cut a hole. So this one we know now needs some attention. So that's one that we're going to work on. But just before we start doing any work with the file, I want to just show you the difference between one of these. So this is the one with the curved cutting edge. So we're going to pop that in. We want to make sure that our corners of the square line up with the jaws. So you can sort of line that up by just visually looking down there, making sure it doesn't turn before you tighten it up, and then just nip that up nice and firm. And we're going to try cutting in the side grain with this. So this is nice and sharp, it's cutting well, you can see the waste falling out, but without having those half moon cutters, you can kind of see how it's torn the edges a little bit, because this I think is more set up for end grain work. So let's just flip this round and see if we come in from the end grain, if we get a slightly better result. One thing I have found is if you try and bore into end grain with the squarer cutters, more often than not it will bottom out and not want to cut. You see it's making a bit of a row, but again I'm not having to put a lot of pressure down or a lot of effort in. You can see the waste coming out quite readily, and because of the nature of the bit and the way it cuts with that curved cutting edge, you can see the entry is a lot cleaner in end grain than it was from the side, and you can actually see here what happens. The waste exits through the hole and then comes up the spiral and kind of feeds out through the top of the hole. So that one's cutting okay. Now let's see, this is the other one with a curved cutting edge, and this one looks a little bit more dull to me. It doesn't look like it's seen any work for a while, but we'll give it a try and see what happens. Sometimes looks can be deceiving. Lock that up in the brace. Now I'm going to just try and drill a hole next door to this, and again it should be in the same way. It's a smaller diameter, this one, but in the same way as the previous cutter worked. It's got curved cutting edges, and again as soon as the lead screws got to the point where the edges are engaging, there's not much happening at all. So that's another one that requires some attention. You can see it's just tearing the wood, it's not actually cutting it, it's building up dust on that cutting edge. So we've got a couple of good ones and a couple of not so good ones, so let's see if we can remedy that with a little bit of sharpening. First of all, we can clean these up in much the same way as we did with the brace. A little bit of white spirit and a wire brush. We'll take off any surface rust. Being careful when we come up around the cutters, but if we're going to sharpen this bit, you don't have to be too worried about that. It's only a brass bristled brush. We could also use the steel wool again, just to clean off any residual muck, but maintain a little bit of the patina that actually looks okay. And then again, any muck in that lead screw where we know that it wasn't particularly sharp, we're going to clean out any of that sawdust to stop it from causing problems in future. You have a little clean up around here. This is quite often where you'll find the numbers. In this case, there's your number. And that looks to me like probably a number 10. So 10/16ths of an inch probably.
And typically you have a maker's mark there as well, right?
There might well be a maker's mark on this part of the shaft as well. It looks like there might be something there, but I'd need magnification to work that one out. But yes, there is a maker's mark there somewhere, and the more you clean it back, the more visible that may become. Again, really, we just want to make sure it's not rusty. Oh yeah. Right, so we're going to have a look at trying to put a little edge back on this part of the cutter here. What's important is that we don't reduce the overall diameter of this, because that's obviously the size hole that it's meant to cut. So we've got to do the work from the inside.
So basically you never cut from the outside?
No, if we take anything off the outside other than just wiping the burr off that we create from the inside, we're going to start reducing the size of the hole that it cuts, which might mean that the bit up here ends up binding in the hole, but it's certainly not going to produce the size hole that you're expecting it to. So yeah, that's the most important thing on any of these. We've got to make sure we work on the inside of the cutter. This part isn't so important because that's only going down into the wood. It's these wings on the outside that are really important to make sure we don't take anything off of the outside of, because they're what's actually making the size of the hole what it should be. So I've just got a small sort of needle file here. It's a round one, and I'm going to try and get in here and just establish the angle that's already set and file it until I hit basically an edge, and hopefully form a little bit of a burr standing up on the outside. The file's actually in contact in both directions, but I'm only putting any pressure on whilst I'm moving forward, so I'm cutting in that direction, not obviously on the back stroke, because the file's only going to cut in one direction. So just got to try and maintain the manufacturer's angles, which I'm hoping that's what I'm following, and not the angles that someone else has set by sharpening it badly. And I can't feel any kind of bite or edge there yet, so I don't think I've removed enough material. Obviously there's only so much you can remove, so hopefully we'll hit an edge fairly soon. But it does look like this bit's actually done a fair bit of work, so we might be having our work cut out to restore this one. Sometimes it helps to just have a little bit of magnification to see exactly what is going on. Still can't feel a burr yet. I'm going to try and get a bit closer. Yeah, there's quite a lot of pitting around this edge. It's got, not only is it worn, it's got a little bit of damage on it, so there's going to have to be a fair bit of filing done to make this work, but we know for a fact that it won't cut at all now, so we've got nothing to really lose by going at it until we actually hit an edge. Right, I can feel a little bit of an edge there now. Let's just have a look. Yeah, it looks like we've got pretty close to hitting an edge, so I'm just going to try and take the burr off on the outside, and for that I'm going to take a file with it's another needle file, but this one's more like a knife blade. It's got a nice flat section to it, and I'm just going to take a really fine grit of wet and dry paper just to take any burr off of the outside edge. So I'm going to go away from the edge in this case, otherwise I just end up cutting the paper, and I'm only cutting on the bit that's going to actually be boring the hole, not the outside of those little wings that cut the sidewalls. What I did notice when I was just under magnification is that the lead screw is very slightly damaged. So I've got another little file here which is quite elliptical with some sharp edges on it. So I'm just going to try and follow the thread round while we've got it in the vise and just open that up. You can sort of just get it to engage and feel that it's following the thread. Doesn't necessarily want to hold on to it all the way, but it's just helping to restore this point very slightly, which will help it to pull down into the wood quickly. Just going to flip it round in the vise very slightly so I can see. You notice I'm gripping on the round part of the shaft, not the wings or the helical bit, because we don't want to deform those. It's hard to see what's going on because it is quite tiny. Yeah, that's definitely a slight improvement. I think we've filed in a satisfactory edge on both sides now. I've just wrapped a little bit of fine grit wet and dry paper around it just to refine that very slightly, and I'm just looking to wipe away any sort of aggressive burr that's there, because that won't really help us to cut any wood, not neatly anyway. So I've just wrapped it around the same file, and this is sort of 2,500 grit, so it's pretty fine. We're not really going to remove any material as such, just hopefully refine what we've already done.
So to repeat, this is the curved one.
Yeah, I believe this is called a gauge pattern, but don't hold me to it. And this is the one with the open wings, so not with the hole through, but with the curved cutter. And you can actually see now we've cleaned it up a little bit. It's a bit neater than it was. And I'm just looking to, again, on the outside, just take off any burr and make sure there's no real harsh bit there. But if we look at it from the end, we've got this clear circular kind of cutting angle. There we are. Just going to pop it into this one. This is one without the ratchet again. Make sure we've got it seated well. Nip that up. And this is the hole that we started to try and cut before. So we can see we got so deep and it didn't want to know. So let's go straight into that hole again. Now with the fact that we've pulled this out once, it might mean that the lead screw doesn't bite and we need to go for a different hole, but we'll see what happens. We might get lucky. Oh, we can already hear that we're getting some cutting going on, which we weren't before. I'm having to put a little bit of pressure down because of the lack of bite on the lead screw, but now it's starting to take over again. It's got a bit deeper into the wood, and there we go. There's a fair bit of these little tiny curly shavings coming out now. You can hear it munching in quite happily. So there we go. It didn't take 5 minutes, obviously. It was a fairly in-depth job, but we've now got a cutter that didn't work at all, had a slightly damaged lead screw, and is now sort of serviceable again. I did have to take a fair bit of material away to get back to a decent angle and cutting edge, but the fact that we've done it now, we'll mark it up with a bit of tape again to know that this one's good to go back in the roll and live to chew a few more holes. So now we'll have a look at this one, which is going to be a slightly different approach to the sharpening, but hopefully we'll get a similar result. So this one is the different pattern. We've got the straight cutter here and these little half moon cutters here. So I don't need a circular file, that would be no good to me at all. What I've got here is a little sort of like a knife blade shaped file, and it's got teeth on the sharp edge if that was going to be the edge of a blade, but then where the spine would be, this is actually quite smooth. So if I want to cut with this file in here to sharpen up these sort of like little half moon wings, if I run the spine on the cutter, on the main cutter, it means I'm not going to actually file any material away, and I can work both sides running that smooth spine on there. So that's what I'm going to start with, because there's no edge on these whatsoever. You can actually see the light catching just here. So the first thing I'm going to do is set that, rock the angle back until I'm in contact, and then just go for it really until I've got a little bit of a burr forming.
And once again, you're only doing the inside, yeah?
Only on the inside, yeah. Again, when we've got a burr and we know it's just a burr, I'll use some very, very fine abrasive just to wipe that burr off, to remove it. But until we've got a burr formed from the inside that I can feel on the outside, there's no value in touching the outside at all. Now I've got a little bit of a burr forming there, so I'm going to work on this side now. Do the same thing. Okay, I've got now, I can feel a very slight burr on both sides of these. So I don't want to touch the outside with the file because it's going to change the diameter of the bit. So I've got some 5000 grit wet and dry just to hopefully remove that burr and push it back to the inside. So it's basically, I'm just trying to wipe the burr off with the minimum of abrasion really. So using this just freehand, I can still feel it a little bit on this side, so I'm going to wrap it around the file just so I've got a harder backer. And I'm not looking to remove material, just stand this burr back up really. There we go. That feels quite smooth on the outside now. Now we can look at the cutting edge itself, which is this bit and this bit. And again, what I'm going to do, we want to get right in to the centre, but what I don't want to do is start sawing through this lead screw with the file. So I'm going to use the spine inwards so I can get contact with the flat edge of the file, but not actually start cutting away material that we want to keep. And you can see the way that these are kind of cut to allow you access to do so. And just for my benefit, I'm going to spin it round a bit so I'm working at a more appropriate angle. And again, I'm going to come in on the inside, on the underneath, and just do the same thing until I raise a little bit of a burr here. And hopefully I'll just be able to catch that with the finger now, and there's nothing to catch yet. This is where you quite often find that people have maybe cheated the angles a little bit and put a steeper angle on than it was designed for, where you might want a bit of a coarser file to correct that maybe. But hopefully this one didn't look too, even though it wasn't cutting, doesn't look too badly abused. Still got a little way. I've got an edge nearly on the inside now, but towards the outside it's still quite a bit of shadow there. So again, I'm putting pressure on when I'm pushing forwards and not on the backstroke. It's just easier to leave it in contact on the backstroke and keep your registration and your angles correct. So I've done this side, flipped it round, and now been working on this side for a while. I'm just going to refine it with a little bit of this wet or dry paper again by wrapping it around the file, so I'm keeping the same surface that I'm working on, just a few strokes just to tidy up and refine that edge a little bit. I'm fairly confident I've hit where I need to in terms of putting the edge on, so it's just a matter of tidying it up a little bit now, making sure we've pushed the burr around a bit. Any clean bits, there we go, and then I need to wrap it right around the tip of the file just so that we can get in the top part here and just make sure again that we've pulled any of that burr all the way off, and it hopefully shouldn't hold on too firm. I can't feel anything with my finger now. Let's just rotate that, do the same thing over here, getting underneath first, a few little swipes to clean up there, and just a little bit right on the tip there, just so we can get in there and mostly come away from the edge to try and push that burr out of the way. Let's see if we've got this one working again. Again, this one we didn't want to cut a hole at all. We've got a hole that we tried to start, and the side cutters started making a bit of an impression. I'm going to go in next to it on this occasion just so we can hopefully see a bit of a difference. Lead screw on this one was in pretty good condition. So in the same place again, we've got the nice side cutter marks, which will keep it fairly clean hopefully. And now the difference being we were able to make a bit of progress. You can see the waste coming out in nice long shavings with absolutely no effort from me here, and yeah, I'd say mission accomplished. So we've done our best there and refurbished a couple of these. It's fiddly work, it's not a massive amount of fun, but hopefully you can see that it is worth doing. Again, just marking this one up to show that we're done, and that can go back in the roll. So that's the thing really, is just have a little try. Sometimes they'll be too far gone and there just won't be enough material there to reset the edges. If that's the case, then they're perfect ones to practice on.
So there you go guys, I hope you enjoyed that video where Lee Stoffer was showing you some beginner's guide to buying the brace and the auger bits, what to look out for, and obviously some restoration tips and refurbishing tips. Now with the bits, it's needless to say, as Lee also mentioned in the video, there are many different styles of these in terms of tips and how they cut, but don't get overwhelmed by that. Just kind of look for the basic things that he's pointed out in this video and just get out there and have some fun with this. So what I'm going to do is put a link below to Lee Stoffer's website and Instagram, both of which he's very active with, and you can go there and it will mean the world to me as a thank you to him for putting this video together, to go and check those out. Also, I've done other videos with Lee on my channel, and if you haven't seen those, head over to my YouTube channel, Z Outdoors, search for Lee Stoffer, and you see the array of videos that I've done with him. So, hope you enjoyed this video, hope it's helped you out, and as always, until the next time, I hope whatever you do, you have a blessed day, a blessed week ahead. This is Zed from Z Outdoors. Peace out.